I am Malcolm, 69 years old, and somehow still processing the betrayal my own stepson handed me, just 5 days after I buried my wife. As the silent architect of our company, I let him believe he held all the power. Last Monday, he called me into the boardroom, slid a severance package across the mahogany table, and fired me. He smirked, telling me the company belonged to the future. I simply handed over my keycard and walked out. He did not know I own 90% of the voting shares. Monday should be very interesting. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who completely underestimated your worth. The mahogany doors of the boardroom swung shut, sealing me inside with the two people I despised most in this world. My black morning suit still smelled of the damp earth and rain from Evelyn's funeral. It had only been 5 days since I watched them lower my wife into the ground. I had come to the office to gather her personal effects, seeking a moment of quiet connection with the woman I had loved and built a life with. Instead, I found myself summoned to the executive suite. Preston, the stepson I had tolerated for 3 decades for Evelyn's sake, did not offer condolences. He sat in his mother's leather chair, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my first car. He did not even look me in the eye before sliding a thick manila folder across the cold glass of the conference table. "We are restructuring, Malcolm," Preston said. His voice lacked any trace of grief. "Consider this your permanent retirement." Bianca, his wife, sat in the corner chair near the window. She was already tracing the lines of the room with her eyes, calculating where she would place her new imported furniture. She wore a bright crimson dress, a deliberate and cruel choice for a family still in mourning. I looked at the folder, then at Preston. "A severance package. Evelyn barely has a headstone, and you are dismantling her executive board." "Evelyn was the past," Preston replied, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "The board needs aggressive, modern leadership. I am the CEO now. As her sole heir, I hold her shares. You are a relic we can no longer afford to carry. The market does not wait for people to finish grieving." I looked at the pages inside the folder. They were offering me a meager buyout, a fraction of what a standard executive would receive, let alone the man who had secretly engineered the company's core infrastructure. I asked for a 30-day transition period to ensure the ongoing employee contracts were secured. I needed to see exactly how far his arrogance would push him. Preston laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound that echoed in the large room. He pressed a button under the desk. The boardroom doors opened immediately, and 2 private security guards stepped inside. They were strangers, not the regular building staff I had known for years. "There is no transition," Preston said, his eyes narrowing with a vicious delight. "You do not belong here anymore. Your office has already been boxed up. Hand over your corporate keycard now." Bianca uncrossed her legs and smiled, leaning forward. "Do not make a scene, Malcolm. It is embarrassing for a man your age to beg. Just take the folder and go live quietly somewhere. You had your run." I did not beg. I did not raise my voice or show them the anger boiling in my chest. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the silver keycard I had used to build this empire from the ground up, and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the glass and stopped right in front of Preston. "You will regret this," I said quietly. "Escort him out," Preston ordered the guards, completely dismissing my warning. I walked out of the building, flanked by 2 heavy-set men in dark suits. Employees I had mentored stared from their cubicles, shocked into silence. The elevator ride down to the executive parking garage was suffocating. I stepped out into the damp, chilly air of the underground lot, heading toward my company-issued sedan. I just wanted to sit in the quiet leather interior and process the sheer audacity of what had just occurred. A tow truck was already hooking up the front tires of my car. I approached the driver, pulling out my keys. "What are you doing? This is my vehicle." The driver handed me a clipboard without looking up. "Sorry, buddy. The order came from the CEO's office 10 minutes ago. The corporate lease is canceled. The vehicle is to be impounded and returned to the dealership today." Preston had not just fired me. He had stranded me. He had planned this ambush meticulously, ensuring my humiliation was complete before I even reached the street. I stood in the cold concrete garage, watching the taillights of the tow truck disappear up the concrete ramp. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated calendar notification. Evelyn's birthday was next week. The grief hit me like a physical blow, heavy and suffocating. But it was quickly swallowed by a cold, calculating rage. I realized then that Preston was not just a greedy child throwing a tantrum. He was actively trying to erase me. I walked up the ramp and out onto the busy city street. The autumn wind bit through my thin morning suit. I hailed a passing taxi, slipping into the back seat and giving the driver my home address. I stared out the window, watching the city blur past, organizing my thoughts. I needed to secure my personal files before Preston tried to lock me out of my own home. When we arrived at the intersection near my neighborhood, I pulled out my personal credit card to pay the fare. The driver swiped it through his machine. It beeped loudly, flashing a red error message on the small screen. "Declined," he said, handing it back over the seat. "Got another card?" I frowned, pulling out my secondary card, a joint account I shared with Evelyn for household expenses. The machine rejected that one too. I tried a third. Declined. Preston had not just taken my job and my transportation. He had frozen the family bank accounts. I realized the scope of his attack. He had used a fraudulent claim as the presumed heir to freeze my access to cash. He was trying to financially suffocate me, hoping I would panic and sign his insulting severance agreement just to survive the week. I looked at the cab driver, who was starting to drum his fingers on the steering wheel. I unclasped the heavy gold watch from my wrist. It was a retirement gift from a loyal vendor 10 years ago, worth more than the driver would make all month. "Take this," I said, dropping the heavy gold timepiece into his open hand. "Keep the change." The driver looked at the watch, his eyes widening, then at me, and nodded quickly. I stepped out of the cab onto the pavement, the cold wind hitting my face. Preston thought he had stripped me of my resources. He thought he had backed an exhausted, grieving old man into a corner, with no way out. He thought his sudden strike had secured his empire. He did not know that Evelyn and I had recognized his true nature long ago. He did not know that we had spent the last 3 years preparing for exactly this kind of betrayal. The game had started, but Preston was playing checkers, while I had already arranged the chessboard. The cab driver looked at the heavy gold watch in his palm. He glanced up at me standing on the cold concrete pavement, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and sudden greed. He did not ask any questions. He simply nodded, shifted the cab into gear, and merged back into the heavy downtown traffic. I stood alone on the sidewalk as the autumn wind cut through my thin morning suit. I had no company car. I had no active credit cards. I had just been fired from the empire I built, and the joint family bank accounts were frozen. Preston had engineered a nearly perfect ambush. He thought he had severed my lifeline. He thought money only existed as numbers on a screen, controlled by passwords and corporate authorizations. He was about to learn the difference between a man who inherits power and a man who builds it. I turned up my collar against the wind and walked exactly 1 block south. I did not panic. I did not scramble to call my lawyer or beg Preston to reactivate my cards. Panic is the reaction of a man who has lost control. I had simply lost the element of surprise. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the downtown financial institution. This was not the modern glass-walled retail branch where Preston did his banking. This was a private wealth management institution that had stood on this corner for over 80 years. The marble floors echoed with the quiet, discreet movements of old money. The head teller recognized me immediately. He offered a polite, sympathetic smile, clearly having heard the news of Evelyn passing away. He began to step out from behind his mahogany counter to escort me to a private office, assuming I was there to discuss the frozen joint accounts. I raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. I did not say a word. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. The teller looked at the key, nodded silently, and gestured toward the secure iron gates at the back of the lobby. He knew exactly what that key meant. If I had tried to swipe my debit card or access the digital banking system, Preston would have known within seconds. My stepson was likely sitting in Evelyn's executive office right now, staring at a monitor, waiting for the bank's automated fraud department to alert him that a desperate, grieving old man was trying to withdraw funds. Preston wanted to watch me fail. He wanted the digital footprint of my desperation. But a physical safety deposit box has no digital footprint. It is a ghost in the financial system. It requires no password, no biometric scan, and no corporate approval. It requires only a matching signature and a piece of carved metal. I followed the vault manager through the heavy iron gates and down a silent, carpeted hallway. The air grew cooler as we descended into the subterranean levels of the building. We approached the massive circular steel door of the main vault. The manager turned his key in the master lock, and I inserted my brass key into the secondary slot. We turned them simultaneously. The heavy internal mechanism clicked open. The manager pulled a long, rectangular metal box from the wall, carried it to a private viewing room, set it gently on the table, and closed the door behind him. I was completely alone. I sat down in the leather chair and stared at the metal box. Evelyn had opened this specific deposit box 10 years ago. It was not registered under the corporate entity, nor was it tied to the family trust that Preston was currently trying to plunder. She had opened it under a private standalone charter. I remembered the exact afternoon she brought the key home. 10 years ago, Evelyn had caught Preston skimming a few thousand from a minor vendor invoice. It was a relatively small amount for a company of our size, a drop in the ocean of our quarterly revenue. Most parents would have written it off as a foolish mistake by an entitled young man. Evelyn did not. She had looked at the altered invoice, her face pale, and told me that a man who steals pennies from his own family will eventually try to steal the entire castle. She recognized the rot in her own son, long before it threatened to collapse our foundation. She knew that one day Preston would try to take everything we had built. "Always have a back door, Malcolm," she had told me that evening, pressing this cold brass key into my palm, "because one day he is going to try to lock the front door." I unlatched the lid of the metal box and opened it. The smell of old paper and dust filled the small room. Inside lay the physical manifestation of my late wife's brilliant foresight. Neatly stacked on the left side of the box were $50,000 in crisp, unmarked $100 bills. It was untraceable cash. It was liquid power. Beside the money sat a cheap, prepaid cellular phone, still sealed in its original plastic packaging. Beneath the phone was a thick manila envelope containing certified copies of our most sensitive foundational documents. Documents that Preston did not even know existed. I reached in and picked up a single sheet of paper resting on top of the cash. It was a handwritten note from Evelyn. Her elegant, sweeping handwriting brought a sudden sharp ache to my chest. "If you are reading this," the note said, "it means I am gone, and my son has finally done exactly what I always feared he would do. Do not let him destroy what we built. Burn him to the ground. I folded the note and placed it carefully in my breast pocket, right next to my heart. The grief that had been threatening to drown me since her funeral was instantly replaced by a cold, absolute focus. Preston had fired me. He had taken my car. He had frozen my accounts. He believed he had stripped me of my armor. He had no idea. He had just handed me the sword. I began transferring the stacks of $100 bills into the various pockets of my suit. The weight of the cash was comforting. It was the weight of leverage. With $50,000, I could hire couriers, pay for off-the-books transportation, and secure private meeting rooms without ever triggering a single alert on Preston's radar. He was fighting a corporate war, using corporate tools. I was stepping off the grid entirely. I picked up the prepaid cellular phone and tore open the plastic packaging. I powered the device on. As the cheap screen lit up, I pulled my expensive company-issued smartphone out of my pocket. Preston was the newly self-appointed CEO. That meant he controlled the IT department. My corporate phone was undoubtedly compromised. His technicians were probably tracking my GPS location right now, waiting to see if I would run to my lawyer's office or crawl back to my empty house. I looked at the metal waste bin in the corner of the private viewing room. I tossed the corporate smartphone inside. Preston could track it all he wanted. He would only find it buried under crumpled banking slips in a subterranean vault. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, sterile air of the vault fill my lungs. The initial shock of the boardroom ambush had completely evaporated. Preston and Bianca had planned their hostile takeover, assuming I would react with emotion. They assumed I would yell, threaten lawsuits, and scramble for control. But the most dangerous man in any room is the one who accepts his losses immediately and begins calculating his counteroffensive in silence. I closed the empty metal box, slid it back into the wall, and locked it. I walked out of the bank and back onto the bustling city street. The wind no longer felt cold. I hailed another taxi, sliding into the back seat and handing the driver a crisp $100 bill before he even asked for a destination. I told him to drive toward the industrial district, far away from the polished glass towers of the financial center. I needed to secure the internal documents before Preston realized his legal claim to the company was entirely built on sand. To do that, I needed an inside man, or more accurately, an inside woman. I needed someone who knew the exact location of the original operating agreement. I needed someone who hated Preston's arrogance just as much as I did. I looked down at the cheap plastic burner phone in my hand. I dialed a number I had memorized over a decade of working together. I listened to the phone ring once, twice, 3 times. Marjorie, the executive assistant who had managed Evelyn's office for 15 years, answered with a hushed, terrified whisper. "Malcolm," she said quickly, "I cannot talk. Preston is firing everyone who was loyal to Evelyn. Security is marching down the hallway right now." I did not offer comfort. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I gave her an address to an underground diner in the industrial district. "Get out of the building, Marjorie," I said firmly. "Do not take your laptop. Do not take any boxes. Just grab your coat, walk out the side exit, and meet me in 20 minutes. We are going to take our company back." I sat in the back booth of a diner that corporate developers and city planners had completely forgotten. The neon sign outside sputtered, casting a pale red glow across the cracked vinyl seats. It was the kind of place where men in expensive suits never ventured, making it the perfect location to plan the destruction of one. I ordered a black coffee and placed the cheap plastic phone face down on the sticky laminate table. The smell of fried grease and strong coffee filled the air. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, glass-walled boardroom where my stepson had just tried to end my career. 20 minutes later, the heavy glass door of the diner swung open. Marjorie stepped inside, pulling her trench coat tight around her shoulders against the autumn chill. She looked exhausted and terrified. For 15 years, she had been the loyal gatekeeper to Evelyn's executive office. She knew every vendor, every executive, and every secret that kept our massive company running smoothly. Now her hands were trembling as she scanned the dimly lit room. She spotted me in this back corner and hurried over, sliding into the booth across from me. She kept glancing at the window as if Preston's private security team was going to burst through the doors at any second. "Malcolm," she said, her voice shaking, "I took a massive risk coming here. Preston has corporate security, monitoring the elevator banks. He fired 3 senior directors this morning before noon. Anyone who ever showed loyalty to you or Evelyn is being escorted out of the building with nothing but a cardboard box." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I did not offer her empty comfort. Pity does not win wars, and I needed her entirely focused. I reached into my suit pocket, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills I had just secured from the vault, and slid it across the table. It was exactly $10,000 in untraceable cash. Marjorie stared at the money, her eyes widening in absolute shock. "Take it," I told her, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Consider it an advance on your next bonus. You are not going to lose your livelihood because a spoiled child is playing dress-up in my boardroom. Now tell me exactly what he is doing." Marjorie slowly pushed the money into her purse. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Her fear began to recede, replaced quickly by a cold and sharp anger. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. "He is not just taking over the company, Malcolm," she said. "He is destroying it entirely. He is pushing through a massive liquidation merger." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. A liquidation merger meant selling the company for spare parts. Marjorie continued, her voice gaining strength. "He has been in closed-door meetings with a massive foreign acquisition firm since the day after Evelyn passed away. They are not buying our brand to maintain it. They are buying our patents, our global client lists, and our physical assets. They are going to dissolve the corporate entity completely." I stared at her, feeling a cold rage hardening my chest into stone. I had spent 40 years building those patents from nothing. Evelyn and I had hired men and women straight out of college, who now had families and mortgages, depending entirely on our payroll. We had built a community, not just a business. "What happens to the staff?" I asked, already knowing the terrible answer. Marjorie swallowed hard, looking down at her hands. "Everyone gets terminated. The foreign firm already has their own global infrastructure. They are just buying our market share to eliminate the competition." Preston negotiated a massive upfront cash payout for himself as the presumed sole shareholder. He takes the money, the company goes bankrupt, and over 600 people lose their jobs by next week. He does not care about the employees at all. He just wants the cash to fund his lifestyle. "When is the signing?" I demanded. "Monday morning," Marjorie replied quickly. "The foreign investors are flying into the city this weekend. They scheduled the final signing for 8:45 on Monday morning. Preston wants the ink dry before the markets open. He is completely frantic. He has the legal team drafting the transfer documents right now. He thinks because he holds Evelyn's shares as her heir, he has the unanimous voting power required to approve a total liquidation." I stared at the dark coffee in my mug. Preston was arrogant, but he was also deeply desperate. He was moving much too fast, fueled by greed and the foolish assumption that grief had rendered me blind and helpless. A total corporate liquidation required unanimous shareholder consent. Preston truly believed he held 100% of the cards. He had no idea that Evelyn had foreseen his endless greed and structured a blind trust that rendered his shares virtually powerless. But there was a missing piece to this puzzle. Preston could not just sell a massive corporation on a verbal claim. He needed physical documentation. The foreign investors would demand to see the operating agreement and the official transfer of assets. How is he bypassing the legal department? I asked, leaning closer to Marjorie. The corporate lawyers require a verified chain of custody for a sale this large. Preston cannot just declare himself the sole owner without the original transfer documents Evelyn signed. Marjorie looked down at the table, her hands twisting together in her lap. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and disgust. "That is the absolute worst part," she whispered. "He does not have the authentic documents. He could not find them in Evelyn's safe, so he created his own." I sat perfectly still. I waited for her to explain the depth of his betrayal. Marjorie explained that she had intercepted a digital file Preston accidentally sent to the central printer network late last night. It was a backdated transfer of assets, bearing a signature that looked almost exactly like Evelyn's signature. But Marjorie had managed Evelyn's personal correspondence for 15 years. She knew the exact slant of her handwriting. She knew the specific blue ink Evelyn always used for legal documents. Preston had forged his own mother's signature just days after her death to expedite the sale of her life's work. The sheer depravity of his actions removed whatever lingering hesitation I had left inside me. I was no longer just protecting my company or saving the jobs of my loyal employees. I was defending my late wife's honor against a thief she had raised. I thought about the warehouse manager who had been with me for 20 years. I thought about the single mother working in the accounting department who had just bought her first home. Preston was perfectly willing to sacrifice hundreds of lives to fund his lavish lifestyle and his wife's endless appetite for luxury. He viewed our employees as expendable numbers on a spreadsheet. He thought he could sign a piece of paper on Monday morning and walk away a billionaire, leaving a trail of absolute destruction behind him. I looked at Marjorie. She was a loyal soldier who had risked her entire career just by sitting in this cheap diner booth with me. I needed her to understand that we were not victims in this scenario. We were the reckoning. "I need the original operating agreement, Marjorie," I said softly. "I need the authentic documents that prove Evelyn placed the voting shares into my blind trust 3 years ago." "Where are they right now?" Marjorie looked at me, her eyes filled with a sudden and sharp panic. "They are hidden in the false bottom of my desk drawer," she said, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "Evelyn gave them to me for safekeeping a year ago. She told me to only give them to you if Preston ever tried to take control of the board. But Malcolm, I cannot get back inside the executive suite. Preston's security guards are watching my every single move. If they search my desk and find those documents before Monday, he will destroy them. The foreign investors will never know they were buying stolen goods, and Preston will get away with everything." I processed this information immediately. The authentic documents were sitting in a desk, inside a building I had just been banned from entering. Preston had an army of security guards patrolling the halls. If Marjorie tried to walk back in and retrieve a hidden file, she would be intercepted instantly. Preston was clumsy, but he was paranoid, and a paranoid man with power is incredibly dangerous. "We are not going to sneak into the building," I told her, finishing my coffee and standing up from the booth. "We are going to let the law walk right through the front door. Go home, Marjorie. Take the weekend to rest. Do not answer any calls from the corporate office. I will see you on Monday morning." I walked out of the diner and into the cold city air. I pulled the prepaid cellular phone from my pocket. I needed a man who understood how to navigate the darkest corners of corporate warfare. I needed a man who fought with the same ruthlessness that Preston thought he possessed. I dialed the private number of Nathaniel Kessler, the most vicious corporate attorney in the city. The game was escalating, and I was about to strip my stepson of every single illusion of power he held. I sat across from Marjorie, in the dim light of the underground diner. The gravity of what she had just told me began to settle in my mind. A liquidation merger is not a simple transaction. You do not just shake hands and hand over the keys to a corporate empire. Selling the physical assets, transferring the global client lists, and dissolving the entire corporate entity requires a very specific legal mechanism. I had structured the company bylaws myself 40 years ago. I knew every clause and every loophole. A total corporate liquidation requires unanimous shareholder approval. It is a safeguard designed specifically to prevent hostile takeovers from within. Preston was moving with reckless speed. He had scheduled a final signing with a foreign acquisition firm for Monday morning. He believed that because Evelyn had passed away, he automatically inherited her 100% public stake in the company. He thought he was the sole shareholder. He thought his signature alone could authorize the destruction of the community Evelyn and I had built. He was completely unaware of the blind trust holding 90% of the voting shares. But that lack of knowledge did not explain how he was bypassing the corporate legal department right now. Our legal team was meticulous. They would never allow a foreign acquisition of this magnitude to proceed without an airtight chain of custody. Preston could not simply walk into the boardroom and declare himself the sole owner. The foreign investors would demand to see the original operating agreement and the official transfer of assets. They would demand a paper trail proving Evelyn had surrendered her authority to him before she passed away. I looked at Marjorie and asked her how Preston was circumventing the lawyers. I told her the foreign firm would demand a pristine chain of custody before transferring a single dollar into his accounts. Marjorie reached into her leather purse. Her hands were still shaking slightly as she pulled out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the sticky laminate table and slid it across to me. She told me she had intercepted a digital file Preston had accidentally routed to the central printer network late last night. She said she printed a hard copy before deleting it from the print queue. I looked down at the document. It was a formal transfer of assets. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. It stated that Evelyn relinquished all her shares and corporate authority to Preston, effective immediately. I looked at the date at the top of the page. It was backdated to 2 weeks ago, a time when Evelyn was confined to a hospital bed, heavily medicated, and incapable of holding a pen. Then I looked at the bottom of the page. There, resting on the signature line, was my late wife's name. I stared at the signature. I had been married to Evelyn for 40 years. I knew the exact way she looped her letters. I knew the specific angle she used when signing legal documents. I knew she always used a fountain pen with midnight blue ink for anything related to the company. The signature on this printed page was a remarkably good imitation, but it was completely devoid of her natural fluidity. It was rigid. The pressure applied to the digital stylus was entirely wrong. It was a calculated, mechanical forgery. My chest tightened with a cold, absolute rage. Preston had not just fired me. He had not just stranded me in a parking garage and frozen my bank accounts. He had forged his dying mother's signature to steal her legacy. He had weaponized her name just days after we buried her. He was desecrating her memory to facilitate a massive corporate theft that would leave hundreds of loyal employees jobless by Monday afternoon. I looked up at Marjorie. I told her this was a forgery. I told her Preston had fabricated the document to satisfy the foreign investors and the legal department. He was trying to push the sale through before anyone could verify the authenticity of the paperwork. Marjorie nodded slowly. She told me Preston had been locking himself in Evelyn's executive office for hours every night this week. He had barred the cleaning staff from entering. He was constructing a false reality to present to the buyers on Monday morning. He was betting everything on the assumption that nobody would dare question the grieving son of the late founder. The sheer depravity of his actions removed whatever lingering hesitation I had left inside me. I was no longer just protecting my company. I was no longer just saving the jobs of the men and women who depended on our payroll. I was going to utterly destroy my stepson. I was going to dismantle his life with the same ruthless efficiency he was trying to apply to my company. But I could not beat a forgery with empty accusations. The foreign investors would not listen to a man who had just been publicly fired and stripped of his corporate access. They would look at Preston's forged document, see Evelyn's name, and process the acquisition. To stop the merger and expose the fraud, I needed the undeniable truth. I needed the original, authentic documents. I needed the physical paperwork proving Evelyn had placed the voting shares into a blind trust under my exclusive control 3 years ago. I needed the documents that proved Preston owned absolutely nothing. I asked Marjorie exactly where the authentic operating agreement was located. I told her we needed the physical copies to present to the foreign investors on Monday morning. Marjorie leaned forward. She lowered her voice to an anxious whisper. She told me Evelyn had given her a sealed envelope for safekeeping over a year ago. Evelyn had explicitly instructed her to hide the documents and only surrender them to me if Preston ever attempted a hostile takeover of the board. She told me the envelope was hidden inside a false bottom panel in her desk drawer in the executive suite. I processed the tactical reality of the situation. The documents that could save the company and send Preston to federal prison were sitting inside a desk in a building I was permanently banned from entering. Preston had an army of private security guards patrolling the halls. If I tried to walk through the front doors, I would be arrested for trespassing before I even reached the elevator banks. I told Marjorie she would have to retrieve the envelope. I told her she needed to walk back into the building on Monday morning, access her desk, secure the documents, and meet me in the lobby right before the final signing. It was a massive risk, but she was the only person who still had an active keycard and access to the executive floor. Marjorie nodded. She took a deep breath and agreed to do it. She said she would go in early on Monday, bypass Preston's security team, and secure the envelope. At that exact moment, a sharp buzzing sound vibrated against the table. Marjorie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She looked at the bright screen. The color completely drained from her face. Her hands began to shake violently. I watched the terror return to her eyes, replacing the brief moment of courage she had just found. I asked her what was wrong. Marjorie swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. She turned the phone around and slid it across the table so I could read the screen. It was an automated text message from the corporate human resources department. The message stated that her employment had been terminated, effective immediately, due to unauthorized absence during business hours. Her corporate keycard had been deactivated. The message advised her that a private security team was currently packing up her personal belongings from her desk and would courier the boxes to her home address. Preston had fired her for leaving the building. My mind raced as the immediate threat materialized. Preston had deployed his security team to clear out her desk. They were actively dismantling her workspace. They were boxing up her files, her supplies, and her drawers. The desk that contained the false bottom panel. The desk that held the original authentic operating agreement. If the security guards found the sealed envelope, they would hand it directly to Preston. He would open it. He would realize his shares were worthless. He would realize the liquidation merger was illegal. And he would immediately destroy the authentic documents in a shredder, erasing the only physical proof of my ownership and Evelyn's true wishes. I had lost the element of surprise. We were completely locked out of the building, and my enemy was currently tearing apart the exact location of our only weapon. The trap was closing fast. I needed to stop those security guards from touching that desk, and I needed to do it without stepping foot inside the corporate headquarters. I watched the text message on Marjorie's phone glow in the dim light of the underground diner. Preston had fired her for unauthorized absence. He had already dispatched his private security team to pack up her desk, the very desk that held the physical proof of my ownership and Evelyn's true wishes, was currently being dismantled by men taking orders from a thief. We had a matter of minutes before a minimum wage guard handed my entire corporate legacy directly to my stepson. I told Marjorie to stay in the booth and keep her phone completely powered off. I walked out the back door of the diner and stepped into the cold, damp alleyway. I pulled out the prepaid cellular phone I had secured from the vault. I dialed a number I had memorized over a decade of navigating corporate warfare. Nathaniel Kessler answered on the first ring. I did not waste time with greetings. I told him Preston had just terminated Evelyn's former executive assistant and was actively clearing out her workspace. I told him the original trust documents were hidden inside the false bottom of her lower right desk drawer. Nathaniel operates like a machine. He did not gasp or ask unnecessary questions. He calculated the timeline instantly. He told me that the physical removal of employee property by corporate security takes approximately 20 minutes from the moment of termination. He said we had exactly a 15-minute window to halt the seizure legally before the boxes reached the executive elevator. I asked him how we were supposed to stop a private security force inside a building I no longer had legal access to enter. Nathaniel told me that 3 years ago, when we established the blind trust to protect the company from Preston, he had quietly filed a preemptive federal injunction regarding the handling of all executive suite physical assets. It was a legal tripwire we had buried deep in the corporate bylaws, just in case Preston ever attempted a hostile takeover after Evelyn passed away. The injunction stated that any physical documents or personal property removed from the executive floor must be intercepted, cataloged, and secured by an independent legal courier before leaving the premises. I told him to pull the tripwire immediately. Nathaniel said he was deploying a bonded federal courier to the corporate loading dock right now. He instructed me to meet the courier at the service entrance in exactly 12 minutes. He hung up the phone. I walked briskly through the industrial district, my mind entirely focused on the geometry of the building I had designed. The executive suites were on the 40th floor. The freight elevator took exactly 3 minutes to descend to the subterranean loading dock. Preston's security team would never walk a terminated employee's belongings out through the polished glass lobby. They would use the service elevator to avoid making a scene in front of the remaining staff. Preston wanted absolute compliance, and public spectacles disrupt compliance. I reached the alleyway behind the corporate headquarters. The massive steel doors of the loading dock were rolled open. 2 commercial sanitation trucks were idling nearby. I stood behind a thick concrete pillar, keeping myself entirely out of sight from the overhead security cameras. I checked the heavy gold watch I no longer had on my wrist. Realizing I had given it to the cab driver, I counted the seconds in my head instead. 11 minutes had passed. A black town car swerved violently into the alleyway. It bypassed the designated delivery zones and parked illegally right in front of the loading dock ramp. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out, holding a heavy leather briefcase. He did not look like a standard delivery boy. He moved with the rigid, calculated posture of a federal agent. I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar and approached him. I identified myself as Malcolm Ashford. The courier nodded briefly, without offering his hand. He told me Nathaniel had transmitted the federal court injunction directly to his secure digital tablet. He said we had the supreme legal authority to seize the boxes, but he warned me that private security guards are entirely unpredictable when trying to impress a new chief executive. At that exact moment, the heavy metal doors of the freight elevator chimed loudly. The thick steel panels slid open. 2 corporate security guards stepped out onto the concrete loading dock. They were pushing a large gray utility cart. Resting on top of the cart were 3 brown cardboard boxes. I recognized the silver picture frames sticking out of the top box. It was Marjorie's entire life boxed up and ready to be discarded. The guards pushed the cart past the delivery bays and headed directly toward a massive commercial trash compactor at the edge of the dock. Preston had not ordered them to ship her personal belongings to her home address. He had ordered them to throw her entire 15-year career into the garbage. He wanted to destroy any physical trace of the old administration. He wanted to erase the past to secure his fraudulent future. I stepped forward, my leather shoes clicking sharply against the concrete floor. The guards stopped pushing the cart and looked at me. One of them immediately reached for the communication radio strapped to his shoulder. He recognized me from the boardroom ambush earlier that morning. He told me I was trespassing on private corporate property and ordered me to leave the loading dock immediately. I did not stop walking. I told him to step away from the utility cart. The guard unclipped his radio and called directly up to the executive suite. He announced that the former chairman was in the loading dock, attempting to interfere with the disposal of terminated property. The legal courier stepped directly in front of the guards, blocking their path to the trash compactor. He did not raise his voice or attempt to physically intimidate them. He simply held up his digital tablet. He displayed the federal court order bearing the verified digital signature of a federal judge. The courier informed the guards that the cardboard boxes on the utility cart were now classified as protected legal evidence under an active federal injunction. He stated with absolute clarity that moving those boxes 1 more inch toward the compactor would constitute the deliberate destruction of legal evidence. He informed them that this action was a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. The guards hesitated. They looked at the digital document and then at the trash compactor. They were paid hourly wages by a private contracting firm. They were perfectly willing to escort an old, grieving widower out of a boardroom on Preston's orders. They were not willing to commit a federal crime and ruin their own lives for him. The guard's radio crackled loudly. Preston's voice echoed through the small speaker, distorted by panic and rage. He demanded to know what was causing the delay. He ordered the guards to throw the boxes in the trash compactor immediately and physically remove me from the premises. I walked directly up to the lead guard. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him that the frantic voice on the radio belonged to a man who was going to be indicted for massive corporate fraud by Monday afternoon. I asked the guard if he truly wanted to share a jail cell with a bankrupt felon just to follow an illegal order. The guard looked at the court order on the tablet again. He looked at my face, realizing I possessed zero fear of the man currently sitting in the executive suite. The guard slowly took his hands off the gray utility cart and took a large step backward. He looked at his partner and told him to stand down. The courier immediately stepped forward and took physical possession of the 3 cardboard boxes. He carried them efficiently to the black town car and placed them gently into the trunk. He handed the lead guard a formal legal receipt of seizure. Preston's voice continued to scream through the radio speaker, demanding an immediate update on the disposal. The lead guard simply reached up to his shoulder and turned the radio completely off. The silence in the concrete loading dock was absolute and deeply satisfying. I thanked the guards for making a highly intelligent decision regarding their own futures. I walked over to the black town car and got into the passenger seat. The courier slammed the trunk shut, got behind the wheel, and drove us away from the corporate headquarters. We merged seamlessly back into the heavy afternoon city traffic, leaving Preston blind and entirely powerless in his stolen office. We drove across the city and pulled into a secure gated parking garage beneath Nathaniel Kessler's law firm. We carried the 3 cardboard boxes up a private, keycard-restricted elevator directly to his personal office suite. Nathaniel was waiting for us. He sat behind a massive solid oak desk, his face an unreadable mask of pure calculation. We placed the boxes on the large conference table and began sorting through Marjorie's personal belongings. We bypassed the coffee mugs, the framed pictures, and the old meeting agendas. I reached into the bottom of the 3rd box and pulled out a heavy, dark wooden desk organizer. I turned it over in my hands. I pressed my thumbs firmly against the bottom wooden panel and applied pressure outward. The wood clicked sharply and slid out of its locked position. There, resting perfectly untouched in the shallow hidden compartment, was a thick manila envelope. It was sealed heavily with dark red wax bearing Evelyn's personal monogram. I broke the wax seal and opened the envelope. I pulled out the crisp, heavy parchment documents. It was the authentic original operating agreement. It bore Evelyn's fluid, elegant signature in her distinct midnight blue ink. The legal language explicitly detailed the creation of the blind trust. It legally and undeniably proved that Preston held absolutely zero voting power in the company. We had the weapon. We had the undeniable proof of ownership. Preston's forged transfer document was now completely and utterly useless. Nathaniel took the documents from my hands and examined them carefully under the bright light of his desk lamp. He nodded slowly. He told me this paperwork was entirely airtight. He said we could walk right into the boardroom on Monday morning, present these documents to the foreign investors, and obligate them to halt the liquidation merger instantly to avoid accessory fraud charges. He placed the authentic operating agreement back on his desk and looked up at me with a grim, tightening expression. He told me that securing the legal ownership of the company was only half the battle. He turned his large computer monitor around so I could clearly see the screen. Nathaniel's team of forensic accountants had been actively tracking the corporate credit lines and internal accounts since I gave them the authorization an hour ago. Nathaniel told me that Preston was not just trying to sell the company on Monday. He was actively draining the liquid cash reserves right now. The computer screen showed a massive wire transfer pending executive approval in the internal banking portal. Preston was currently attempting to move $12 million from the primary employee payroll fund directly into a private offshore account registered exclusively in Bianca's name. If that wire transfer cleared the international banking system over the weekend, the company would bounce thousands of paychecks on Monday morning. Hundreds of loyal families would default on their mortgages. The company would face an immediate insolvency, regardless of who held the legal operating agreement. Preston realized his corporate position was fragile, so he was trying to loot the vault before he burned the entire building to the ground. I had the authentic legal documents to stop the sale of the company, but I needed to stop that $12 million wire transfer tonight before Preston destroyed thousands of lives. I sat across from Marjorie in the dim light of the underground diner. The gravity of what she had just told me began to settle in my mind. A liquidation merger is not a simple transaction. You do not just shake hands and hand over the keys to a corporate empire. Selling the physical assets, transferring the global client lists, and dissolving the entire corporate entity requires a very specific legal mechanism. I had structured the company bylaws myself 40 years ago. I knew every clause and every loophole. A total corporate liquidation requires unanimous shareholder approval. It is a safeguard designed specifically to prevent hostile takeovers from within. Preston was moving with reckless speed. He had scheduled a final signing with a foreign acquisition firm for Monday morning. He believed that because Evelyn had passed away, he automatically inherited her 100% public stake in the company. He thought he was the sole shareholder. He thought his signature alone could authorize the destruction of the community Evelyn and I had built. He was completely unaware of the blind trust holding 90% of the voting shares. But that lack of knowledge did not explain how he was bypassing the corporate legal department right now. Our legal team was meticulous. They would never allow a foreign acquisition of this magnitude to proceed without an airtight chain of custody. Preston could not simply walk into the boardroom and declare himself the sole owner. The foreign investors would demand to see the original operating agreement and the official transfer of assets. They would demand a paper trail proving Evelyn had surrendered her authority to him before she passed away. I looked at Marjorie and asked her how Preston was circumventing the lawyers. I told her the foreign firm would demand a pristine chain of custody before transferring a single dollar into his accounts. Marjorie reached into her leather purse. Her hands were still shaking slightly as she pulled out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the sticky laminate table and slid it across to me. She told me she had intercepted a digital file Preston had accidentally routed to the central printer network late last night. She said she printed a hard copy before deleting it from the print queue. I looked down at the document. It was a formal transfer of assets. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. It stated that Evelyn relinquished all her shares and corporate authority to Preston, effective immediately. I looked at the date at the top of the page. It was backdated to 2 weeks ago, a time when Evelyn was confined to a hospital bed, heavily medicated, and incapable of holding a pen. Then I looked at the bottom of the page. There, resting on the signature line, was my late wife's name. I stared at the signature. I had been married to Evelyn for 40 years. I knew the exact way she looped her letters. I knew the specific angle she used when signing legal documents. I knew she always used a fountain pen with midnight blue ink for anything related to the company. The signature on this printed page was a remarkably good imitation, but it was completely devoid of her natural fluidity. It was rigid. The pressure applied to the digital stylus was entirely wrong. It was a calculated, mechanical forgery. My chest tightened with a cold, absolute rage. Preston had not just fired me. He had not just stranded me in a parking garage and frozen my bank accounts. He had forged his dying mother's signature to steal her legacy. He had weaponized her name just days after we buried her. He was desecrating her memory to facilitate a massive corporate theft that would leave hundreds of loyal employees jobless by Monday afternoon. I looked up at Marjorie. I told her this was a forgery. I told her Preston had fabricated the document to satisfy the foreign investors and the legal department. He was trying to push the sale through before anyone could verify the authenticity of the paperwork. Marjorie nodded slowly. She told me Preston had been locking himself in Evelyn's executive office for hours every night this week. He had barred the cleaning staff from entering. He was constructing a false reality to present to the buyers on Monday morning. He was betting everything on the assumption that nobody would dare question the grieving son of the late founder. The sheer depravity of his actions removed whatever lingering hesitation I had left inside me. I was no longer just protecting my company. I was no longer just saving the jobs of the men and women who depended on our payroll. I was going to utterly destroy my stepson. I was going to dismantle his life with the same ruthless efficiency he was trying to apply to my company. But I could not beat a forgery with empty accusations. The foreign investors would not listen to a man who had just been publicly fired and stripped of his corporate access. They would look at Preston's forged document, see Evelyn's name, and process the acquisition. To stop the merger and expose the fraud, I needed the undeniable truth. I needed the original, authentic documents. I needed the physical paperwork proving Evelyn had placed the voting shares into a blind trust under my exclusive control 3 years ago. I needed the documents that proved Preston owned absolutely nothing. I asked Marjorie exactly where the authentic operating agreement was located. I told her we needed the physical copies to present to the foreign investors on Monday morning. Marjorie leaned forward. She lowered her voice to an anxious whisper. She told me Evelyn had given her a sealed envelope for safekeeping over a year ago. Evelyn had explicitly instructed her to hide the documents and only surrender them to me if Preston ever attempted a hostile takeover of the board. She told me the envelope was hidden inside a false bottom panel in her desk drawer in the executive suite. I processed the tactical reality of the situation. The documents that could save the company and send Preston to federal prison were sitting inside a desk in a building I was permanently banned from entering. Preston had an army of private security guards patrolling the halls. If I tried to walk through the front doors, I would be arrested for trespassing before I even reached the elevator banks. I told Marjorie she would have to retrieve the envelope. I told her she needed to walk back into the building on Monday morning, access her desk, secure the documents, and meet me in the lobby right before the final signing. It was a massive risk, but she was the only person who still had an active key card and access to the executive floor. Marjorie nodded. She took a deep breath and agreed to do it. She said she would go in early on Monday, bypass Preston's security team, and secure the envelope. At that exact moment, a sharp buzzing sound vibrated against the table. Marjorie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She looked at the bright screen. The color completely drained from her face. Her hands began to shake violently. I watched the terror return to her eyes, replacing the brief moment of courage she had just found. I asked her what was wrong. Marjorie swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. She turned the phone around and slid it across the table so I could read the screen. It was an automated text message from the Corporate Human Resources Department. The message stated that her employment had been terminated, effective immediately, due to unauthorized absence during business hours. Her corporate keycard had been deactivated. The message advised her that a private security team was currently packing up her personal belongings from her desk and would courier the boxes to her home address. Preston had fired her for leaving the building. My mind raced as the immediate threat materialized. Preston had deployed his security team to clear out her desk. They were actively dismantling her workspace. They were boxing up her files, her supplies, and her drawers. The desk that contained the false bottom panel. The desk that held the original authentic operating agreement. If the security guards found the sealed envelope, they would hand it directly to Preston. He would open it. He would realize his shares were worthless. He would realize the liquidation merger was illegal. And he would immediately destroy the authentic documents in a shredder, erasing the only physical proof of my ownership and Evelyn's true wishes. I had lost the element of surprise. We were completely locked out of the building, and my enemy was currently tearing apart the exact location of our only weapon. The trap was closing fast. I needed to stop those security guards from touching that desk, and I needed to do it without stepping foot inside the corporate headquarters. The glowing computer monitor in Nathaniel Kessler's office cast a pale light across the heavy oak desk. The digital clock in the corner of the screen read the afternoon. We had exactly 18 minutes before the international banking window closed for the weekend. If that $12 million wire transfer cleared the clearinghouse and reached Bianca's offshore account, the money would vanish into a labyrinth of untraceable shell companies. My employees would face ruined credit, bounced mortgages, and empty refrigerators by Monday. Preston was trying to hold a match to a powder keg, and I needed to extinguish the flame immediately. Nathaniel looked at the authentic operating agreement resting on his desk. He did not hesitate. He picked up his secure telephone and dialed the direct emergency line for the vice president of our primary corporate banking institution. The bank held the main operating accounts for our entire global infrastructure. The vice president answered on the second ring, his voice tense. He told Nathaniel that Preston had been calling the bank every 10 minutes, screaming at the representatives to expedite the $12 million transfer. Preston was claiming executive privilege. He was threatening to move the entire corporate portfolio to a rival bank if they delayed the wire any longer. Nathaniel put the phone on speaker. He told the vice president that the man currently sitting in the chief executive office had zero legal authority to authorize a transfer of $10, let alone $12 million. The vice president demanded immediate proof. He stated that the corporate registry currently listed Preston as the sole heir and acting executive following Evelyn's passing. I leaned forward and spoke directly into the speakerphone. I identified myself. I told the vice president I was currently looking at the original, unmodified operating agreement bearing Evelyn's authentic signature. I told him I was transmitting a certified digital copy of the documents directly to his secure server right now. Nathaniel fed the heavy parchment pages through a high-speed encrypted scanner. We watched the progress bar on the screen. The vice president remained silent on the other end of the line. The seconds ticked down. The file transmission completed. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard through the speakerphone. As the vice president opened the document, I knew exactly what he was reading. He was reading the brilliant, undeniable legal fortress my late wife had constructed 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Evelyn and I had sat in this exact same law office, late on a rainy Tuesday evening. She had just spent the entire afternoon quietly auditing a minor regional subsidiary that Preston was supposed to be managing. She had discovered a network of phantom vendors. Preston had been creating fake invoices, approving them himself, and funneling the payments into his personal accounts. It was a clumsy, arrogant theft. Evelyn did not confront him. She did not yell or threaten to cut him out of the will. She simply realized, with a quiet and devastating clarity, that the son she had raised possessed absolutely no moral compass. She told me that night that a man who steals from his own family will not hesitate to destroy the lives of thousands of employees just to line his own pockets. Evelyn was a visionary. She loved her son, but she loved the community we had built far more. She refused to let our legacy become a casualty of his endless greed. So she systematically dismantled his future. She ordered Nathaniel to restructure the entire corporate entity. She authorized the creation of a blind trust. She transferred 90% of her voting shares directly into that trust and named me as the sole irrevocable trustee. She left exactly 10% of the company in Preston's name. They were classified as Class B non-voting shares. It was enough to provide him with quarterly dividend payouts, but it stripped him of every single ounce of executive authority. Preston could not hire a janitor without my approval. He certainly could not liquidate a global empire. The vice president on the speakerphone finally broke the silence. His voice had completely changed. The bureaucratic hesitation was gone, replaced by absolute professional compliance. He confirmed receipt of the authentic operating agreement. He confirmed the legal structure of the blind trust. He confirmed that I was the sole individual possessing the authority to move corporate funds. I gave him a direct, unequivocal order. I told him to cancel the $12 million wire transfer to the offshore account instantly. I ordered him to freeze every single internal executive account associated with Preston and Bianca. I told him to lock down the payroll funds and restrict all outbound capital transfers until I personally visited the branch on Monday morning. The vice president agreed immediately. We watched the banking portal on Nathaniel's computer screen refresh. The pending $12 million wire transfer vanished. The status of the payroll accounts shifted to locked and secured. The bleeding was officially stopped. Hundreds of my loyal employees would receive their paychecks on schedule. Their families were safe. I leaned back in the leather chair and let out a slow, steady breath. Preston had fired me at 9 in the morning, assuming I was a powerless, grieving old man. By 5 in the afternoon, I had completely neutralized his ability to touch a single dime of corporate money. He was currently sitting in a glass tower, completely oblivious to the fact that his financial oxygen had just been permanently cut off. But Nathaniel did not relax. He did not close his laptop or offer a celebratory handshake. The ruthless attorney simply adjusted his glasses and kept his eyes glued to the secondary monitor on his desk. His team of forensic accountants had been running a deep algorithmic audit on the corporate ledgers since we arrived. They were analyzing every single transaction Preston had authorized over the last 6 months, exploiting the brief window where he assumed nobody was watching. Nathaniel's printer suddenly engaged, spitting out a thick stack of financial reports with rapid, aggressive mechanical sounds. Nathaniel grabbed the warm pages and began scanning the highlighted lines. His jaw tightened. We had stopped a catastrophic collapse, but the internal damage Preston had already inflicted was staggering. Preston had not just been waiting to sell the company on Monday morning. He and Bianca had been actively leveraging the company credit lines for months, anticipating the massive payout from the foreign investors to cover their tracks. Nathaniel slid the audit reports across the desk. I looked at the itemized expenses. The numbers were sickening. Preston had utilized a shadow ledger, hidden deep within the marketing and acquisitions budget. He and Bianca had drawn millions of dollars against the corporate credit facility. They were not spending this money on business development or research. They had purchased a $4 million estate in an exclusive gated community under a newly formed limited liability company. They had acquired 2 luxury yachts, registering them as corporate entertainment vessels, while harboring them at a private marina thousands of miles away from our nearest client. Bianca had charged hundreds of thousands of dollars in designer clothing, private jet charters, and high-end jewelry directly to a corporate expense account disguised as global marketing outreach. Preston was living the life of a billionaire using stolen money. He was entirely dependent on the Monday morning liquidation merger to finalize. He needed the foreign investors to buy the company, so he could use his fraudulent payout to quietly erase the massive corporate debt he had accumulated. He was playing a dangerous, highly illegal game of financial roulette. I stared at the audit reports, feeling the cold rage harden into a weapon. Preston and Bianca had treated my life's work like a personal ATM. They had stolen from the men and women who actually built this company. I looked at Nathaniel. I told him we had enough evidence right now to send Preston to federal prison for embezzlement, wire fraud, and corporate espionage. I told him we could call the authorities tonight and have Preston arrested in his stolen mansion before the sun went down. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. He stacked the audit reports into a neat pile. He told me that calling the police right now would be a massive tactical error. If we arrested Preston on a Friday night, the foreign investors would see the news over the weekend. They would realize they were negotiating with a criminal. They would pull their capital, cancel the meetings, and fly back to their home country. Preston would go to jail, but he would go to jail claiming he was the victim of a corporate misunderstanding. Bianca would file for bankruptcy and attempt to shield the stolen assets in lengthy, drawn-out civil litigation. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. He told me we needed to let Preston walk into that boardroom on Monday morning. We needed to let him sit down with the foreign investors. We needed him to present the forged transfer document in a room full of highly influential global executives. We needed to execute him publicly. If we waited until Monday morning, we could present the authentic operating agreement directly to the foreign acquisition team. We could expose Preston's forgery in front of the very people he was trying to defraud. We could trap him in a room with nowhere to run, proving his absolute guilt, not just to a judge, but to the entire financial sector. We could strip him of his unearned wealth, his fraudulent title, and his freedom, all at the exact same moment. I understood the strategy perfectly. A quiet arrest on a Friday night is a mild inconvenience. A public execution in a glass boardroom on a Monday morning is a permanent destruction. I agreed to the plan. I told Nathaniel to prepare the final legal notices. We were going to let Preston enjoy his weekend. We were going to let him sleep in his stolen mansion and dream about the millions he thought he was about to secure. We were going to let his arrogance build to an absolute peak so the fall would utterly shatter him. The trap was fully set. The authentic documents were secured. The money was frozen. The fraudulent credit lines were exposed. I stood up from the heavy oak desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window in Nathaniel's office. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline, watching the streetlights ignite as the autumn sun disappeared behind the concrete towers. Evelyn's legacy was safe. The company was secure. Now all that remained was the total and absolute dismantling of the man who had tried to erase me. Monday morning was going to be a masterpiece. The heavy oak door of Nathaniel Kessler's office closed with a solid thud, sealing us inside a soundproof vault of glass and steel. High above the city, the ambient noise of the streets vanished completely. Nathaniel did not offer me a drink. He did not attempt to offer hollow sympathy for my late wife. He operated with the cold, mechanical precision of a surgeon about to perform a vital operation. He gestured to the polished granite conference table, occupying the center of the room. I carried the heavy, dark wooden desk organizer we had extracted from Marjorie's boxes and placed it on the cold granite surface. Nathaniel stood on the opposite side of the table, his hands resting flat against the stone, his eyes locked on the wooden object. He knew exactly what was hidden inside. He had been the one to suggest the false bottom to Evelyn 3 years ago. I pressed my thumbs firmly against the bottom wooden panel of the organizer. I applied pressure outward. The wood clicked sharply and slid out of its locked position. Resting perfectly untouched in the shallow, hidden compartment was a thick manila envelope. It was sealed heavily with dark red wax bearing Evelyn's personal monogram. I picked up the envelope. The weight of it in my hands was immense. This was not just a collection of legal papers. This was Evelyn's final act of protection. It was her shield, forged in secret, designed to protect the thousands of lives that depended on our company. I broke the wax seal. The brittle red flakes fell onto the polished granite. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of crisp, heavy parchment documents. I handed the documents across the table to Nathaniel. He took them with the utmost care. He did not smile. He simply adjusted his glasses and began to read. As Nathaniel meticulously reviewed every single clause and signature, the sterile silence of the law office allowed my mind to drift back to the exact moment these documents were born. It was 3 years ago, on a bitter, freezing evening in late November. Evelyn and I had been sitting in our home study. She was reviewing the annual performance reports for a regional subsidiary we had entrusted to Preston. We had given him that division as a test. We wanted to see if he possessed the leadership capabilities necessary to eventually take over the corporate empire. We wanted to believe he could mature into the role. But Evelyn was a visionary, and she was entirely uncompromising when it came to the truth. She did not just read the bottom-line revenue. She read the human cost of those numbers. She discovered that Preston had artificially inflated his quarterly profit margins by systematically terminating the health benefits of our most vulnerable employees. He had reclassified dozens of full-time warehouse workers as independent contractors, stripping them of their pensions and their medical coverage, all to secure a massive personal performance bonus for himself at the end of the fiscal year. I remember watching Evelyn reading those reports. She did not scream. She did not throw things across the room. Her reaction was far more terrifying. She went completely still. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a devastating clarity. She told me that a man who views human beings as disposable assets will not hesitate to burn down the entire forest just to warm his own hands. She realized in that exact moment that her son lacked a fundamental moral compass. She loved him, but she refused to let her love become a weapon that destroyed the lives of the loyal men and women who had built our company. The very next morning, Evelyn scheduled a private, off-the-books meeting with Nathaniel Kessler. Nathaniel flipped to the third page of the operating agreement, his eyes scanning the dense legal terminology he had drafted himself 3 years ago. He began to read the specific clauses aloud, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. He confirmed the legal structure of the blind trust. Evelyn had systematically stripped Preston of every single ounce of executive authority. She had transferred 90% of her voting shares directly into an irrevocable blind trust. She named me, Malcolm Ashford, as the sole and exclusive trustee. She structured the transfer so that it superseded any previous will or standard inheritance law. Preston was left with exactly 10% of the company in the form of Class B non-voting shares. He was legally entitled to receive quarterly dividend payouts. He would always be wealthy. He would never have to work a day in his life. But he was permanently locked out of the cockpit. He could not hire an intern without my signature. He certainly could not authorize a total corporate liquidation merger with a foreign acquisition firm. Nathaniel set the documents down on the granite table. He looked up at me. He stated that this operating agreement was completely airtight. He said it was a legal masterpiece. Preston's forged transfer document, the one he planned to present to the foreign investors on Monday morning, was now completely and utterly worthless. We possessed the weapon that would utterly annihilate his hostile takeover. But Nathaniel did not stop there. He is a man who believes that stopping an enemy is never enough. You must dismantle their capacity to ever fight again. He walked over to his massive oak desk and pressed a button on his intercom. He ordered his elite team of forensic accountants to enter the office immediately. 3 men and 1 woman walked into the room carrying encrypted laptop computers. They did not speak. They set their machines up on the conference table and immediately connected to the secure digital architecture of Nathaniel's law firm. Nathaniel instructed them to initiate a deep algorithmic audit of our company's internal financial ledgers. He told them to bypass the public-facing accounts and dig directly into the executive shadow ledgers. He wanted to know exactly what Preston and his wife Bianca had been doing with the corporate credit lines since Evelyn passed away. He wanted to know the exact depth of their greed. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city skyline, as the quiet, rapid sound of keystrokes filled the sterile room. The accountants worked with terrifying speed. They were hunting digital ghosts. They were tracking the flow of capital that Preston thought he had perfectly hidden. It did not take long. Within 45 minutes, the lead accountant, a severe-looking woman with sharp eyes, stopped typing. She looked up at Nathaniel and slowly turned her laptop monitor around so we could see the screen. The numbers glowing on the display were sickening. Preston and Bianca had not just been waiting for the Monday morning liquidation to cash out. They had been actively looting the corporate treasury for months, leveraging the company's immaculate credit rating to fund an incredibly lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. They were spending money that did not belong to them, banking on the massive payout from the foreign investors to quietly erase their tracks before the annual audits. The accountant brought up a series of offshore wire transfers and shell company registrations. She explained the entire fraudulent architecture with cold precision. Preston and Bianca had formed an anonymous limited liability company 6 months ago. Using that hidden entity, they had drawn massive unauthorized loans against the corporate credit facility. They used the stolen funds to purchase a $4 million estate in an exclusive gated community on the edge of the city. The deed was buried behind layers of corporate privacy shields, but the money trail led directly back to our primary operating accounts. The accountant clicked a button, bringing up another set of records. Bianca had been charging hundreds of thousands of dollars to a corporate expense account designated for international marketing outreach. She was not buying advertising space. She was chartering private jets for weekend shopping trips to Europe. She was purchasing high-end bespoke jewelry and importing custom luxury vehicles. Furthermore, Preston had authorized the purchase of 2 massive luxury yachts. He had registered them as corporate entertainment vessels, an aggressive and highly illegal tax evasion strategy. The yachts were currently harbored at a private marina thousands of miles away from our corporate headquarters, far out of sight from any legitimate business operations. I stared at the screen, feeling my pulse steady into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat of absolute resolve. They were living the lives of billionaires on stolen money. They were financial parasites. Nathaniel walked over and stood beside me. He looked at the massive mountain of debt Preston had secretly accumulated. He explained the brutal reality of Preston's current situation. He told me that Preston was completely trapped in a financial prison of his own making. He and Bianca had absolutely no way to pay for the mansion, the yachts, or the private jets. They were drowning in millions of dollars of unauthorized corporate debt. The only possible way Preston could avoid immediate bankruptcy and federal embezzlement charges was to successfully sell the entire company on Monday morning. Preston desperately needed the foreign investors to sign the liquidation agreement. He needed that massive upfront cash payout to quietly pay back the stolen funds before the corporate board realized the money was missing. The Monday morning merger was not just a business deal for him. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to cover up a massive crime. If the merger failed, Preston would be instantly ruined. The corporate debt would crush him. The shell companies would collapse. The authorities would seize the mansion and the yachts. He would be left with absolutely nothing, facing decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and corporate espionage. Nathaniel turned to me, his eyes gleaming with a predatory intelligence. He told me that we held the absolute power of life and death over Preston's future. We held the authentic operating agreement that proved he had no authority to sell the company. We held the forensic audit that proved he had stolen millions of dollars. We could destroy him with a single phone call. But a sudden, sharp, ringing tone cut through the sterile silence of the law office. Nathaniel's private cellular phone was vibrating on his desk. He walked over, picked it up, and looked at the screen. His expression instantly hardened. He answered the call, listened for exactly 10 seconds, and hung up without saying a word. He looked at me from across the room. The predatory gleam in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, urgent intensity. He told me that his legal clerks at the downtown courthouse had just intercepted an emergency legal filing. Preston's lawyers had not just been sitting idle. They had just submitted a petition to a federal judge requesting an emergency, immediate guardianship over my life and my assets. Preston was officially claiming that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. He was claiming that grief had entirely shattered my mental capacity, rendering me incapable of making legal or financial decisions. Preston knew that if I tried to interfere with the sale, He needed a way to legally silence me. If a judge granted the emergency guardianship, my signature would become worthless. My authority over the blind trust would be instantly invalidated. Preston would be granted full control over my medical care, my finances, and my legal rights. He could lock me in a psychiatric facility by Wednesday and sell the company without any opposition. Nathaniel told me the judge had scheduled an expedited, closed-door hearing for Tuesday morning. The timeline had just violently compressed. Preston was launching a devastating preemptive strike against my freedom. I could not wait for the legal system to slowly process his fraud. If I did not utterly annihilate my stepson on Monday morning, he would legally erase my existence by Tuesday afternoon. The trap was set, and the stakes had just become absolute. Monday morning arrived with a cold and heavy rain, the kind of rain that washes the city streets clean and leaves everything looking sharp and unforgiving. I stood on the pavement outside the corporate headquarters I had built 40 years ago. I looked up at the towering glass structure piercing the gray sky. For the last 5 days, my stepson believed he owned this building. He believed he owned the legacy my late wife and I had bled for. He was about to learn that a stolen crown is the heaviest thing a man can wear. I walked through the revolving doors and stepped into the massive marble lobby. The morning rush of employees was already over. The space was quiet and echoing. I saw the new private security guards Preston had hired, standing near the elevator banks. They were young men in cheap suits, looking bored and distracted. They did not recognize me. Preston had erased my face from the corporate directory, but he forgot to revoke my biometric access to the private executive elevator hidden in the back corridor. Evelyn and I had installed that private lift a decade ago. It bypassed the lobby security systems entirely. I pressed my thumb against the hidden scanner panel on the wall. The green light flashed and the stainless steel doors slid open silently. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the 40th floor. The elevator ascended with a smooth and rapid hum. I did not feel any fear. I did not feel any sadness. I only felt a cold and absolute certainty. I had the authentic operating agreement secured in my briefcase. I had the financial audit, proving Preston had stolen millions of dollars. I had everything I needed to burn his fraudulent empire to the ground. The doors opened onto the executive suite. The floor was completely silent. I walked past the reception area. I looked at the empty desk where Marjorie had sat for 15 years. Preston had cleared it out completely, leaving nothing but a bare wooden surface. He wanted to erase the past so he could control the future. I turned the corner and walked down the long hallway toward the main boardroom. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling glass, allowing me to see exactly what was happening inside. Preston was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table. He was wearing a dark blue suit and a red silk tie, leaning forward with an expression of supreme arrogance. Sitting across from him were 4 men in immaculate gray suits. They were the acquisition executives from the foreign firm. They had briefcases open and laptops glowing. Resting in the center of the table was a thick stack of legal paper. It was the liquidation contract. It was the document that would end the jobs of 600 loyal employees and funnel millions of dollars into an offshore account controlled by Bianca. Bianca was standing near the large corner window overlooking the city. She was wearing a sleek white dress, holding a crystal champagne flute. An expensive bottle of champagne was chilling in a silver bucket on a side table. She was smiling a wide and greedy smile, just waiting for Preston to sign his name. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully navigated a massive corporate theft without a single consequence. I placed my hand on the heavy stainless steel handle of the boardroom door. I did not knock. I simply pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, sealing us all inside. The sudden noise caused everyone in the room to stop talking. The four foreign executives turned around in their leather chairs, looking at me with mild confusion. Bianca lowered her champagne flute, her smile instantly vanishing. Preston froze. His hand had been hovering just above the liquidation contract, holding a gold fountain pen. He stared at me, as if a ghost had just walked into the room. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. For a fraction of a second, I saw the absolute terror of a child who knows he has been caught. But the terror quickly morphed into a desperate and furious anger. He slammed the gold pen down onto the mahogany table. He stood up abruptly, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. He demanded to know what I was doing there. He yelled across the room, telling me I was trespassing on private property and that I had been permanently retired. He looked at the foreign investors and offered them a frantic and forced smile. He told them I was his late mother's grieving widower. He told them I was suffering from severe dementia and that I had wandered into the building by mistake. The foreign executives looked at each other uncomfortably. They were professional men who did not want to be involved in a messy family drama. One of them closed his laptop slightly, clearly disturbed by the sudden outburst. Bianca stepped forward, placing her champagne flute on the table. She told me to leave the room immediately. She used a slow and condescending voice, as if she were speaking to a confused child. She said they were in the middle of a highly sensitive business transaction, and that my presence was completely inappropriate. I did not say a word to her. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on Preston. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the empty chair at the opposite end of the long table. I placed my leather briefcase on the polished wood. Preston began to panic. He realized I was not leaving. He reached under the table and slammed his hand against the emergency security button. He shouted into the room, telling me I had exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out before he had me physically dragged through the lobby. He told the investors to ignore me, claiming the legal department was currently processing a medical guardianship over my affairs. I stood at the end of the table and looked at the thick liquidation contract resting in front of him. I told him he was celebrating a bit too early. I told him the champagne was premature. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open violently. 2 large private security guards rushed into the room. They were breathing heavily, clearly having sprinted from the elevator bank. They looked at Preston for orders. Preston pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. He ordered the guards to remove me from the building immediately. He told them to use whatever force was necessary to get me out of his sight. The 2 large men stepped forward. Their faces were tense and aggressive. They reached their hands out, preparing to grab my arms and physically drag me away from the table. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. I simply raised my right hand in a sharp and commanding gesture. I spoke with a voice that carried 40 years of absolute corporate authority. I told the guards to stop exactly where they were standing. I warned them that if they took one more step toward me, they would be committing a federal assault against the legal and rightful owner of this entire corporate entity. The guards hesitated. They looked at my calm demeanor, and then looked at Preston's red and sweating face. Security guards are trained to recognize true authority. They know the difference between a man who holds real power and a man who is simply pretending. I looked at the lead guard and told him the man sitting in the chief executive chair was currently under active investigation for massive corporate fraud. I told him that if he laid a single finger on my suit, he would be named as an accessory in a federal indictment by the end of the day. The guards stopped moving entirely. They lowered their hands and took a slow step backward away from me. They looked at Preston with deep uncertainty. Preston screamed at them. He slammed his fists against the table, demanding they do their jobs. He told them he was the chief executive officer and that he was ordering them to throw me out. I unclasped the brass latches of my leather briefcase. The sharp metal clicks echoed in the tense and silent room. I told Preston he was not the chief executive officer. I told him he was simply a thief sitting in a stolen chair. The foreign investors were now fully alert. The lead executive, a man with silver hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward. He asked me exactly who I was and what I meant by corporate fraud. He stated that his firm had been assured by the legal department that Preston Ashford held sole, unencumbered ownership of the company. I looked directly at the foreign investor. I told him his firm had been lied to. I told him the man sitting across from him had forged his dying mother's signature to authorize an illegal corporate liquidation. Bianca gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hand. Preston's face contorted into a mask of pure panic. He shouted at the investors, telling them I was a crazy old man making wild and desperate accusations. He pleaded with them to ignore me and sign the contract so they could finalize the merger. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the heavy manila envelope bearing Evelyn's red wax seal. I placed it gently on the polished mahogany table, right next to their empty champagne glasses. The room grew incredibly still. The only sound was the heavy rain beating against the large glass windows. I looked at Preston and watched his entire fraudulent empire begin to crumble. He had built a massive house of cards, relying entirely on my silence and my grief. He thought he could outrun his own crimes by selling the company before anyone noticed the missing money. I told the foreign investors that the document sitting in front of Preston was entirely worthless. I told them that Evelyn Ashford had legally stripped her son of all executive voting rights 3 years ago. I informed them that any signature they placed on that liquidation contract would legally bind their acquisition firm to a massive international fraud scheme. Preston tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat worked nervously as he stared at the sealed manila envelope. He knew he had never seen that envelope before. He knew he had searched Evelyn's office a dozen times, looking for any hidden documents. He realized in that agonizing moment that he had walked blindly into a trap that had been set for him years ago. The foreign executives looked at the heavy envelope and then looked at Preston's pale, sweating face. The lead investor slowly reached out and closed his laptop with a quiet, definitive snap. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted from a celebratory acquisition to a tense and highly dangerous legal standoff. I kept my hand resting on top of the envelope. I did not break eye contact with my stepson. The real game had just begun, and he was entirely unarmed. The 2 private security guards remained frozen near the heavy glass doors. Their eyes shifted nervously between Preston and me. Preston was still sweating, and his chest was heaving as he tried to regain control of the room. He pointed a shaking finger at the guards and screamed at them to do their jobs. He offered to double their pay on the spot. He told them I was a trespasser and a liar. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I reached back into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. It was not a corporate document. It bore the official embossed seal of the city records department. I slid it across the polished mahogany table toward the lead security guard. I told him to read the name listed as the sole proprietor of the commercial real estate. 40 years ago, when Evelyn and I first expanded the company, we made a strategic financial decision. We established the corporate entity to manage the business operations, but I purchased the physical land and the glass tower using my own private capital. The corporation simply leases the office space from me. Preston believed he was sitting in his own boardroom. He did not realize he was sitting inside a building that belonged entirely to me. I owned the concrete beneath his feet. I owned the glass walls surrounding him. I owned the very chair he was currently sweating in. I looked at the lead security guard. I told him that as the legal owner of the premises, I was officially terminating his private contracting firm. effective immediately. I informed him that his company no longer had jurisdiction on my property. I gave him and his partner exactly 30 seconds to exit my building before I called the local precinct to have them arrested for armed trespassing. The guard looked at the property deed. He looked at the embossed city seal. He did not look at Preston again. He nodded respectfully to me and tapped his partner on the shoulder. They both turned and walked out of the boardroom without saying a single word. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them. Preston watched his physical protection vanish. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The illusion of his power was evaporating in real time. Bianca backed away from the window. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped her crystal champagne flute. She realized the security guards were not coming back to save them. I turned my attention away from my stepson and focused entirely on the 4 foreign executives sitting across the table. They were seasoned corporate acquisition specialists. They had flown across the world to finalize a massive liquidation merger. They were men who dealt in absolute certainties and airtight contracts. They were currently looking at a room descending into absolute legal chaos. The lead investor adjusted his posture. He was a man with silver hair and sharp eyes. He demanded a clear and immediate explanation. He stated that his firm had transferred an initial deposit of $5 million into a holding escrow late Friday afternoon, based on Preston's sworn legal assurances. He said they were prepared to wire the remaining capital upon the execution of the contract sitting on the table. I placed my hand on the heavy manila envelope resting next to the champagne bucket. I broke the dark red wax seal with my thumb. The brittle pieces fell onto the mahogany surface. I pulled out the original and authentic operating agreement. I slid the crisp parchment documents across the table until they rested directly in front of the lead investor. I told him to read the 3rd page. I told him to look at the specific legal architecture Evelyn had constructed 3 years ago. The investor put on his reading glasses. He leaned forward and began to read the clauses aloud to his colleagues. His voice was steady and professional, but the words he spoke hit Preston like physical blows. The document explicitly detailed the creation of the irrevocable blind trust. It confirmed the immediate transfer of 90% of the voting shares into my exclusive control. It named me as the sole trustee with absolute authority over any sale or merger or liquidation of the corporate entity. The investor stopped reading. He looked up at Preston. His expression had shifted from confusion to pure, unadulterated hostility. He realized his firm had been deliberately misled. I looked directly at the foreign acquisition team. I told them that the man sitting at the head of the table owned exactly 10% of the company in the form of Class B non-voting shares. I informed them that Preston Ashford possessed 0 executive authority. I stated clearly that he did not have the legal right to hire a receptionist, let alone liquidate a global infrastructure and sell off international patents. I pointed to the liquidation contract sitting in front of Preston. I told the investors that if they signed that document, they would not be acquiring a corporation. They would be acquiring a massive federal indictment for accessory to corporate fraud. The lead investor took off his glasses. He looked at the fraudulent contract and then looked at Preston. He demanded to know how Preston had managed to bypass the corporate legal department to initiate this acquisition. He demanded to know what kind of forged documentation Preston had submitted to their international legal team last week to prove his ownership. Preston began to stammer. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an excuse that did not exist. He claimed it was a family misunderstanding. He claimed the trust documents I provided were outdated, and that Evelyn had verbally promised him full control before she died. He was grasping at invisible straws, trying to construct a defense out of sheer panic. I did not let him finish his pathetic lie. I told the foreign executives exactly how Preston had bypassed our lawyers. I told them he had locked himself inside his dying mother's office last week. I told them he had used a digital stylus to mechanically trace Evelyn's signature onto a backdated transfer of assets. I told them they were currently negotiating a multi-million-dollar acquisition with a man who had forged documents while his mother was taking her last breaths. Bianca dropped her champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending sharp pieces of crystal and expensive alcohol splashing across the polished surface. She stared at Preston in absolute horror. She was incredibly greedy, but she was not stupid. She knew the difference between aggressive corporate maneuvering and blatant, undeniable federal forgery. The foreign investors did not say another word to Preston. The lead executive snapped his briefcase shut. He told his colleagues to pack their machines immediately. He turned to me and offered a brief, respectful nod. He stated that his firm would be initiating an immediate recall of their escrow funds. He assured me their legal department would cooperate fully with any federal investigation regarding Preston's fraudulent claims. The four men walked out of the boardroom in absolute silence. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing Preston and Bianca inside with me. The massive liquidation merger was completely dead. The foreign capital was gone. The grand escape plan Preston had built to cover his massive corporate debts had just evaporated in front of his eyes. Preston stood frozen at the head of the table. He stared at the empty chairs where the investors had just been sitting. His chest was rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His arrogant posture had completely vanished. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was finally realizing there was no net waiting at the bottom. I did not offer him any sympathy. I did not raise my voice or gloat. True power does not require celebration. True power simply asserts reality and allows the consequences to fall exactly where they belong. I reached into my briefcase one more time and pulled out the thick stack of financial audits Nathaniel's forensic accountants had generated over the weekend. I set them gently on the table. I told Preston I knew exactly why he was trying to sell the company in such a desperate rush. I told him I knew about the $4 million estate he purchased through a hidden shell company. I told him I knew about the luxury yachts harbored thousands of miles away from our corporate jurisdiction. I told him I had full documentation of every single unauthorized transaction he and Bianca had drawn against the corporate credit facility. Bianca stepped away from the broken glass on the floor. Her face was ashen. She looked at the financial audits sitting on the table and then looked at her husband. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She asked Preston if the money they had been spending was truly stolen from the corporate accounts. Preston could not even look his wife in the eye. He stared at the mahogany table, completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of his own actions. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of unearned wealth, and I had just stripped that illusion away with clinical precision. I told Preston that the foreign investors were never going to save him. I told him his plan to use the liquidation payout to quietly erase his stolen debts was officially over. He was trapped in a financial prison of his own making, and I held the only key. Preston finally found his voice. It was weak and trembling. He begged me to listen to him. He pleaded that he was under immense pressure and that he had made terrible mistakes while grieving his mother. He tried to weaponize Evelyn's memory to elicit my mercy. He claimed we were family, and that family takes care of each other. I looked at the son my wife had loved and realized there was nothing left of him but a hollow shell of greed. I told him family does not forge signatures. I told him family does not throw a grieving widower out onto the street 5 days after a funeral. I told him he had severed his ties to this family the moment he handed me that severance folder. The room was silent except for the rain hitting the glass. I stood at the end of the table, entirely in control of the empire I had built. The boardroom belonged to me again. The company was safe. The employees were protected. The only thing left to do was watch my stepson drown in the natural consequences of his own boundless arrogance. Preston stared at the red wax resting on the polished wood. He knew his back was against a wall, but a desperate man will always throw one final punch. He reached down into his bespoke leather briefcase resting on the floor. His hands were shaking so violently he fumbled with the brass latches. He pulled out a sleek black folder and slammed it onto the glass surface, right next to Evelyn's authentic trust document. He told the lead investor to ignore everything I had just said. He claimed my documents were outdated relics from a time before Evelyn changed her mind. He said his document was the final and binding transfer of assets. He slid his forged paper across the table. He pointed to the bottom line, where Evelyn's forged signature rested in dark blue ink. He told the foreign executives that this transfer was signed just 2 weeks ago. He insisted it superseded any blind trust created 3 years prior. He was begging them to believe a lie that could send them all to federal prison. The lead investor looked down at the new document. He was cautious. He was a man who dealt in billions of dollars, and he understood that a battle of paperwork in a locked boardroom usually ended in massive litigation. He looked at me, expecting me to shout or snatch the paper away. I did not move. I did not need to argue with a desperate thief. I simply turned my head and looked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The doors pushed open. Nathaniel Kessler walked into the room. He did not walk in alone. Beside him was a tall man with sharp eyes, carrying a heavy aluminum case. I looked at the foreign investors and introduced Nathaniel as my personal corporate counsel. I introduced the man beside him as a licensed private forensic investigator specializing in digital document authentication. Preston's face turned from a pale white to a sickly shade of gray. He tried to stand up tall and order them out of the room. He shouted that this was a closed meeting and that they were trespassing. Nathaniel ignored him completely. He walked straight to the mahogany table and picked up Preston's forged transfer document. Nathaniel spoke with the cold authority of a judge handing down a final sentence. He told the foreign acquisition team that the document in his hand was a fabricated piece of garbage. He turned to the forensic investigator and handed him the paper. The investigator placed his aluminum case on the table and unlatched it. He pulled out a portable ultraviolet scanner and a digital magnification lens. He placed Preston's forged document flat on the table and illuminated it with the ultraviolet light. He explained the exact science of the forgery to the silent room. He pointed out that the dark blue ink resting on the signature line lacked the physical indentation of a real fountain pen. He explained that a human hand applying wet ink leaves a microscopic trench in the paper fibers. The signature on this document was entirely flat. It was a high-resolution mechanical print created by a robotic stylus. The investigator then pointed to the top right corner of the page under the ultraviolet light. He revealed a tiny pattern of microscopic yellow tracking dots printed by the corporate laser machine. He explained that every commercial printer embeds a hidden timestamp and serial number into every page it produces. He read the timestamp aloud to the room. He explained that this specific piece of paper was printed exactly 3 days after Evelyn Ashford had fallen into an irreversible coma. I looked directly at the lead foreign investor. I asked him if his international firm made a habit of finalizing billion-dollar mergers using mechanical signatures from comatose women. The lead investor stood up immediately. His expression was a mask of absolute disgust. He did not say a single word to Preston. He did not ask for a counter-argument. He looked at his 3 colleagues and gave a sharp, definitive nod. The 4 executives gathered their laptops and legal pads in perfect unison. They snapped their briefcases shut. They were professionals who understood instantly that they had been dragged into the center of a federal crime scene. Preston panicked completely. He physically stepped in front of the boardroom door, blocking their exit. He screamed that it was a massive misunderstanding. He begged them to stay in the room. He promised to cut the acquisition price in half. He was offering them a massive discount on a stolen empire, just to get his hands on a fraction of the cash. The lead investor looked at Preston with pure, unadulterated contempt. He told my stepson to step aside before he called the authorities himself. He stated clearly that his firm would be actively cooperating with any federal investigation regarding this attempted corporate fraud. He warned Preston never to contact their offices or their legal department ever again. Preston stepped aside, defeated. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind the four men. The massive buyout was officially dead. The foreign capital was gone forever. The single lifeline Preston needed to save himself from total financial ruin had just evaporated into thin air. He was left alone in the room with the men who had just destroyed his entire future. Preston snapped. The reality of his complete destruction broke his mind. He slammed his fists against the polished mahogany table. He screamed that I had no real power. He shouted that I was a senile old man who belonged in a locked medical facility. He yelled that he had already filed an emergency petition for guardianship and that a federal judge would strip me of my rights by tomorrow morning. He was clinging to a legal maneuver that was now entirely useless. Bianca stopped watching her husband. The survival instinct of a deeply greedy woman finally kicked in. She realized Preston had lost the company and the massive payout. She knew the federal authorities were going to start asking questions about their lavish lifestyle by the end of the day. She had married a man she believed was the sole heir to a massive corporate fortune. She had spent the last week picking out imported furniture for an office that would never belong to her. She had spent the last 6 months charging private jets and luxury goods to a stolen corporate credit card. Now she was standing in a room with the man who held the absolute power to send them both to a federal penitentiary. Her priority shifted instantly from acquiring new wealth to protecting whatever stolen cash she still had access to. She needed to transfer the remaining funds out of her personal accounts and secure a vicious legal defense team. She opened her designer purse and grabbed her smartphone. Her fingers flew across the screen as she opened her international banking application. She was desperately trying to check her offshore balances so she could wire a massive retainer to a criminal defense attorney before the police arrived. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind the foreign acquisition team, sealing Preston and Bianca inside the boardroom with their own destruction. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of a massive multi-million-dollar illusion collapsing into dust. Preston stood frozen at the head of the mahogany table. His eyes were wide and completely vacant. He was staring at the space where the investors had just been sitting, unable to comprehend that his entire future had just walked out of the room. Bianca did not share his paralysis. Her survival instinct was entirely mercenary, and it had just kicked into overdrive. She realized instantly that the massive corporate buyout was dead. She knew that without the foreign capital, they had absolutely no way to cover the millions of dollars they had secretly drained from the company. She did not look at her husband to offer comfort. She looked down at her designer handbag and frantically pulled out her smartphone. I stood at the end of the table and watched her manicured fingers fly across the glowing screen. She was opening her international banking application. She was trying to access her offshore shell accounts to wire a massive retainer fee to a criminal defense attorney before the authorities arrived. She needed liquid cash, and she needed it immediately. I watched the exact moment her digital world imploded. The color drained completely from Bianca's face, leaving her skin a sickly pale gray. Her mouth parted in a silent gasp. She tapped the screen again, pressing her thumb against the glass with frantic, desperate force. She refreshed the application. She switched to her secondary checking account. She tried to access the joint executive credit lines. Every single screen returned the exact same red error message. Account frozen. Available balance 0. Bianca looked up from her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently, she almost dropped the device onto the floor. She looked at Preston, and her voice cracked as she demanded to know what was happening to their money. She told him every single bank account she tried to access was completely locked down. I did not give my stepson the opportunity to formulate another pathetic lie. I spoke directly across the length of the long wooden table. I told Bianca her accounts were not experiencing a technical glitch. I told her I had personally instructed the executive vice president of our primary financial institution to freeze every single asset bearing her name exactly 30 minutes ago. I watched her breath hitch in her throat as the reality of my words settled over her. I explained that the massive corporate credit facility she had been treating as her personal playground was permanently closed. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the cold, hard facts do the crushing. I told her I knew exactly what she and Preston had been buying with my money. I told her I knew about the $4 million estate in the exclusive gated community. I recited the exact name of the anonymous limited liability company they had registered to hide the purchase. Preston flinched as if I had struck him physically. He finally looked away from the empty chairs and stared at me in absolute horror. He realized the forensic audit was not just a threat, it was a completed roadmap of his entire criminal existence. I did not stop. I told Bianca I knew about the 2 luxury yachts currently moored at a private marina thousands of miles away. I told her I had the complete itemized receipts for every private jet charter, every piece of bespoke jewelry, and every imported vehicle she had illegally charged to the global marketing budget. I informed her that the money she thought she was securing for a defense lawyer was already in the process of being legally clawed back into the corporate treasury. Bianca stepped away from Preston, as if standing too close to him would cause her to catch a disease. The realization was washing over her in real time. She was not married to a billionaire chief executive. She was married to a bankrupt felon who had just been caught forging federal documents. She was completely broke, and she was heavily implicated in a massive embezzlement scheme. Nathaniel Kessler did not give them a single moment to process the sheer scale of their financial ruin. The ruthless corporate attorney stepped forward and walked directly up to Preston. Nathaniel pulled a crisp white envelope from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He did not hand it over politely. He slapped it flat against Preston's chest, forcing my stepson to grab it before it fell to the floor. Nathaniel spoke with the brutal, mechanical efficiency of an executioner. He stated clearly for the record that the document inside the envelope was a formal notice of immediate termination with cause. He informed Preston that he was officially stripped of his executive title, his corporate salary, his health benefits, and his access to the building. Preston stared down at the white envelope, trembling. He tried to open his mouth to argue, but his voice simply failed him. He was completely outmatched and outgunned on a battlefield he thought he controlled just 20 minutes ago. Nathaniel was not finished. He delivered the final devastating blow with a terrifying calm. He informed my stepson that the preliminary forensic audit had already uncovered exactly $3 million in blatantly embezzled corporate funds. He stated that the company was formally demanding the total repayment of that stolen capital in full. Nathaniel leaned closer to Preston and laid down the absolute deadline. He told him he had exactly until 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon to wire the $3 million back into the primary corporate operating account. If the money was not returned by the deadline, Nathaniel promised to hand the unredacted financial audits, the forged transfer document, and the digital printer logs directly to the federal authorities. He promised to personally ensure that both Preston and Bianca faced maximum sentences for wire fraud and corporate espionage. The financial guillotine had completely fallen. Preston dropped the termination envelope. It fluttered to the floor, landing near the broken pieces of Bianca's crystal champagne flute. He could not even hold the paper. He was staring into the absolute abyss of his own making. He had no company to sell. He had no cash to hire a defense lawyer. He had $3 million in corporate debt hanging over his head, and he had exactly 4 days to find a way to pay it back. He fell backward into his heavy leather chair. He buried his face in his trembling hands. The arrogant man who had slid a severance folder across this very table, just 5 days ago, was completely gone. He was replaced by a broken, terrified criminal who finally understood that he had tried to steal from the wrong man. Bianca did not kneel beside her husband to offer comfort. She did not reach out to hold his hand or offer a single word of support. She looked at the white termination envelope resting on the hardwood floor and then looked at Preston with a level of absolute, pure disgust. She realized in a matter of seconds that she was no longer the wealthy wife of a powerful chief executive. She was legally bound to a bankrupt criminal who owed $3 million to a corporation that was about to destroy him. Her voice cut through the heavy silence of the boardroom, sharp and unforgiving. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid. She told him he had promised her an empire, and instead, he had delivered a federal indictment. Preston tried to reach for her. He pleaded with her to calm down, telling her they could figure it out together. He said they just needed to secure a temporary loan to cover the stolen funds before Friday. He was grasping at invisible lifelines, hoping his wife would stand by him in the wreckage. Bianca stepped away from him, as if he were carrying a deadly physical disease. She laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed against the glass walls. She asked him, who on earth would loan $3 million to a man who had just been publicly caught forging his dead mother's signature? She told him he was completely ruined. She stated clearly, for the room to hear, that she had absolutely no knowledge of the corporate shadow ledgers or the embezzled funds. She announced she was a victim of his deception and that she refused to let him drag her down into a prison cell with him. She told him to fix the situation immediately, or she would file for divorce and testify against him to save her own skin. She turned her back on him completely and walked over to the far window, staring out at the city she could no longer afford to conquer. She had tossed him to the wolves without a second thought. Preston was left standing alone in the center of the room. He had lost his foreign investors. He had lost his corporate empire. He had just lost the loyalty of his own wife. He slowly turned his head and looked at me, standing at the end of the long mahogany table. The arrogant sneer he had worn all week was completely gone. His shoulders slumped forward, and his hands began to shake uncontrollably. He took a slow, hesitant step toward me. He did not try to negotiate or offer empty corporate threats. He simply broke. He fell to his knees, right there on the polished hardwood floor of the boardroom. He looked up at me, with tears streaming down his pale face. He begged me to call Nathaniel off. He pleaded with me to cancel the Friday deadline and let him walk away quietly. He swore he would sign any document I wanted and surrender his remaining 10% of the non-voting shares if I just let him keep his freedom. He cried that he was desperate and that the massive pressure of his hidden debts had clouded his judgment. He tried to weaponize the one thing he thought could still manipulate my emotions. He brought up his mother. He begged me to show mercy for Evelyn's sake. He cried that we were family. He sobbed that Evelyn would never want to see her only son locked away in a federal penitentiary for embezzlement and fraud. He told me that despite everything he had done, he was still my son, and that a father is supposed to protect his family from harm. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The patience and tolerance I had tried to cultivate for 30 years had been completely extinguished. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the cold, hard truth crush whatever remaining hope he held. I told him he lost the right to use his mother's name the exact moment he used a machine to forge her signature onto a stolen document. I told him he had desecrated her memory to steal the very legacy she spent her entire life building. I reminded him that Evelyn had seen his true nature long before I did, and that she was the one who designed the blind trust to stop him. I walked around the large wooden table and stopped, just a few feet away from where he was kneeling. I looked down at his tear-stained face. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. I told him a father is supposed to protect his family. I explained that was exactly why Evelyn and I had built an impenetrable legal fortress to keep him out of our company. We needed to protect the hundreds of loyal employees who relied on us to feed their children. I told him family does not steal millions of dollars from honest working people to buy luxury yachts and mansions. I reminded him of his actions just 5 days ago. I told him family does not ambush a grieving widower in a boardroom and throw him out onto the street. I told him family does not tow a man's vehicle and freeze his bank accounts while he is still wearing a mourning suit. I told him he severed his ties to my family the absolute second he demanded my corporate key card and ordered security to escort me away. Preston sobbed heavily, staring at the floor. He knew my words were true, and he knew there was no escaping the Friday deadline. I told him I did not want his 10% of the non-voting shares. I wanted the $3 million he had stolen, and I expected the wire transfer to clear my accounts before the banks closed on Friday. I told him, if the money was short by a single penny, the federal authorities would be waiting for him at his stolen estate. The flashing red and blue lights of the local police cruisers reflected against the rain-slicked glass of the boardroom windows. Nathaniel Kessler had timed their arrival perfectly. He had coordinated with his contacts in the Financial Crimes Division over the weekend, providing them with enough preliminary evidence to secure immediate detention warrants. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom opened one final time. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives stepped into the room. They did not look impressed by the mahogany table or the sweeping views of the city. They looked directly at Preston and Bianca. The lead detective approached my stepson. He stated in a clear and authoritative voice that Preston was being detained for questioning regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the forgery of legal documents. Preston did not fight back. He did not yell or demand to call a lawyer. The absolute reality of his situation had finally crushed the last remaining ounce of his arrogance. He slowly stood up from his chair and placed his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs, echoing in the silent boardroom, was the sound of absolute justice. Bianca immediately backed away toward the wall. She raised her hands defensively and told the detectives she had absolutely nothing to do with her husband and his illegal activities. She repeated her claim that she was an innocent victim of his financial deception. The lead detective did not show a single ounce of sympathy. He informed Bianca that her name was listed as the primary beneficiary on multiple offshore shell accounts currently under federal investigation. He told her she was also being detained as a person of interest in a massive money laundering conspiracy. Another officer stepped forward and placed Bianca in handcuffs. She began to cry, but her tears were entirely selfish. She was mourning the loss of her stolen wealth and the terrifying prospect of a prison cell. I stood at the end of the long wooden table and watched the police escort my stepson and his wife out of the boardroom. They were led down the long executive hallway. The remaining corporate staff stood outside their cubicles and watched the procession in absolute silence. The employees saw the man who had threatened their livelihoods being marched toward the freight elevator in disgrace. Preston kept his head completely lowered. He could not look the honest, hard-working people of this company in the eye. Bianca stumbled slightly in her expensive shoes, her designer dress wrinkled, and her pride entirely shattered. I watched the steel doors of the elevator close behind them. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering sadness. I only felt the profound and necessary relief of removing a toxic parasite from a healthy body. The corporate infection had been entirely eradicated. Nathaniel Kessler packed his forensic reports back into his leather briefcase. He gave me a single, respectful nod and walked out of the room to coordinate the incoming legal storm with the authorities. I was finally completely alone in the executive suite. I walked slowly around the large mahogany table. I stopped at the head of the room and looked down at the massive leather chair. It was the chair Evelyn had occupied for decades. It was the seat of power she had used to build a global community of dedicated workers. I reached out and ran my hand along the smooth leather backrest. I turned the chair around and sat down. The physical sensation of taking back control washed over me. I felt the immense weight of the company settle onto my shoulders, but it was a familiar and welcome weight. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought of Evelyn. I knew she was resting peacefully now. Her brilliant foresight had saved everything we loved. I reached across the desk and picked up the secure executive landline. I dialed the number for the underground diner in the industrial district. The owner answered, and I asked him to hand the phone to the woman waiting in the back booth. Marjorie answered a few seconds later. Her voice was hesitant and laced with lingering anxiety. I told her the building was completely clear. I told her the police had removed the threat and that she needed to return to the executive suite immediately. 20 minutes later, Marjorie walked cautiously through the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. She was still wearing her trench coat, and her eyes darted around the room as if expecting an ambush. She looked at the broken champagne glass on the floor, and then looked at me, sitting in the chief executive chair. Her shoulders instantly relaxed. She let out a long, shuddering breath of pure relief. I told Marjorie to take a seat at the table. I did not offer her the job of an executive assistant. I told her that a company rebuilding from a traumatic internal breach required leadership that understood loyalty, sacrifice, and the true value of our employees. I told her that effective immediately, she was being promoted to the position of Chief Operating Officer. I informed her that her new salary would reflect the immense risk she had taken to protect this company. Marjorie stared at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. She nodded slowly, completely overwhelmed by the sudden and massive restoration of her career. She thanked me and promised she would never let Evelyn's legacy falter. I told her I already knew that to be true. I instructed her to begin contacting the department heads to reassure the staff that their jobs were secure and their paychecks would clear on schedule. Marjorie walked out of the boardroom with a renewed sense of purpose and absolute confidence. I stood up from the leather chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. The heavy morning rain had finally stopped. The thick gray clouds were beginning to break apart over the city skyline. A bright and piercing ray of morning sunlight cut through the overcast sky, illuminating the glass towers and the busy streets below. The storm had passed. The corporate treasury was safe. The employees were protected from the greed of a spoiled child. Order had been completely restored to my world. I looked out at the city I had helped build, knowing that Evelyn's legacy would survive long after I was gone. Monday had indeed been very interesting, but tomorrow was going to be beautiful. If this experience has taught me anything, it is that true power does not reside in loud demands or arrogant displays of stolen wealth. True power is cultivated in silence, built on a foundation of integrity, preparation, and unwavering resolve. We often mistake family ties for guaranteed loyalty, but blood does not automatically grant someone a moral compass. When people show you their true nature through their actions, you must believe them immediately. You must protect what you have built and the people who depend on you, even if it means cutting away someone you once loved. Justice requires both patience and the courage to act decisively when the moment arrives. Please let me know your thoughts on this story in the comments below. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this.